When Japanese soldiers surrendered during the final months of World War II, most of them believed they were walking toward humiliation, starvation, or death. Years of imperial doctrine had taught them that surrender was worse than dying, and enemy captivity meant cruelty without limit. From the islands of the Pacific to the prison camps hastily assembled after Japan's collapse, Japanese prisoners of war expected fists, beatings, and revenge. What they encountered instead would leave many of them stunned, confused, and in some cases emotionally shaken for the rest of their lives. To understand why American treatment felt so shocking, we must begin long before the surrender ceremonies and barbed wire camps. Imperial Japan entered the war with a military culture shaped by Bushido, an ideology that glorified sacrifice and obedience above survival. Soldiers were trained to believe that capture was unforgivable. Manuals explicitly stated that prisoners were already dead men. This belief was not theoretical. Japanese forces had treated Allied POWs brutally throughout the war, from Bataan to Burma, reinforcing the expectation that Americans would do the same in return. By 1945, however, the war had turned decisively against Japan. Cities burned, supply lines collapsed, and entire garrisons were cut off and starving. When surrender finally came, many Japanese soldiers marched toward American lines, trembling with fear. Some expected immediate execution. Others believed they would be worked to death. A few were so ashamed that they avoided eye contact, convinced that any moment of weakness would be punished. Instead of rifle butts, they were often met with cigarettes. Instead of shouting, they heard calm instructions. Instead of starvation, they were given water, medical attention, and food that many had not tasted in years. For soldiers who had survived on handfuls of rice or roots pulled from the jungle, the first American meal felt unreal. Some prisoners hesitated, suspecting poison or trickery. Guards had to demonstrate that the food was safe by eating it themselves. American policy toward prisoners was shaped by a very different philosophy. The United States followed the Geneva Convention, but beyond legal obligation, there was a strategic calculation. Treating prisoners humanely reduced resistance, encouraged surrender, and undermined enemy propaganda. For American officers, kindness was not weakness, it was leverage. Yet for Japanese prisoners, this distinction meant nothing at first. All they could see was a reality that contradicted everything they had been taught. Medical care was one of the first shocks. Wounded Japanese soldiers expected to be ignored or left to die. Instead, American medics cleaned wounds, administered morphine, and performed surgeries using scarce resources. In several camps, Japanese POWs received better medical treatment than local civilian populations devastated by war. Former prisoners later recalled the strange humiliation of being cared for by an enemy they had been taught to despise. The psychological impact was profound. Some prisoners broke down, crying after days or weeks of kindness, unable to reconcile American behavior with the image of the enemy painted by wartime propaganda. Others remained suspicious, convinced that the cruelty would come later. But as weeks turned into months and abuse never arrived, many began to re-examine everything they believed about the war. Daily camp life further deepened the shock. Prisoners were assigned work, but it was regulated, paid with camp credits, and accompanied by regular meals. They were allowed to write letters. They were protected from abuse by guards under strict discipline. In some camps, Japanese prisoners were allowed to organize cultural activities, maintain gardens, or teach language classes. These small freedoms felt almost surreal to men who had expected chains. Perhaps most unsettling was the attitude of ordinary American soldiers. Guards often spoke casually, cracked jokes, or showed curiosity rather than hatred. Some even expressed sympathy, saying the war was over and everyone wanted to go home. For prisoners raised to believe that Americans were savage barbarians, this behavior was deeply destabilizing. It forced an uncomfortable realization. The enemy they feared did not exist in the way they had imagined. This realization planted a seed that would grow throughout captivity. If Americans were not monsters, then what had the war truly been about? If surrender did not bring disgrace, then what was the value of dying for a lost cause? These questions haunted many Japanese POWs long after the barbed wire faded from view. By the end of this segment, one truth becomes clear. The greatest shock was not the food, the medicine, or the lack of punishment. It was the collapse of an entire worldview. Kindness, offered where cruelty was expected, became one of the most powerful weapons the Americans wielded in the final chapter of the Pacific War. By the time Japanese prisoners of war began arriving on American soil, most of them carried a lifetime of fear with them. From their earliest days in the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, they had been taught that surrender was worse than death. Captivity, they believed, meant torture, starvation, and humiliation. American soldiers, according to wartime propaganda, were supposed to be brutal, racially hateful, and eager to take revenge. Many Japanese POWs fully expected that the moment they laid down their weapons, their lives would effectively be over. This fear did not come from nowhere. Japanese military doctrine during the 1930s and early 1940s was built around the concept of absolute loyalty and death before surrender. Soldiers were told again and again that capture was shameful not only for themselves, but for their families and ancestors. As a result, most Japanese troops fought to the end, and those who were captured often did so while wounded, unconscious, or completely exhausted. When these men woke up under American guard, they expected beatings or execution. Instead, the first shock came almost immediately. Japanese POWs arriving at American processing centers were searched, medically examined, and then, to their disbelief, treated for their wounds. Doctors cleaned injuries, applied bandages, and even performed surgeries. Men who believed they were considered less than human suddenly found themselves being spoken to calmly, sometimes through interpreters, sometimes with gestures and patience. For many prisoners, this moment shattered years of indoctrination in a single afternoon. Food was the next surprise. Japanese soldiers had endured severe ration shortages throughout the war. In many units, hunger was constant. Rice portions were reduced, protein was scarce, and by the later years of the conflict, starvation was common. Prisoners expected captivity to mean even less food. Instead, they were given regular meals that often exceeded what American civilians themselves were eating under rationing. Bread, meat, vegetables, coffee. These were luxuries to men who had survived on minimal rations for months or years. Some Japanese POWs later recalled that their greatest fear was not physical pain, but moral collapse. They had been taught that American kindness would be a trick, a way to soften them before punishment. Yet days passed, then weeks, and the cruelty never came. Guards followed rules. Camp discipline existed, but it was predictable and structured. There were no random beatings, no executions, no deliberate starvation. As prisoners were transferred deeper into the United States, the scale of the country itself became another shock. Trains carried them across vast distances, farmland stretching to the horizon, endless rail lines, cities larger than anything many had ever imagined. Through the slats of train cars or guarded windows, they saw factories, highways, and towns that seemed untouched by war. For men who had watched Japanese cities burn under bombing raids, this was deeply unsettling. Inside the camps, daily routines further challenged everything they believed. Prisoners were assigned work, often light labor such as farming, maintenance, or kitchen duties. They were paid small wages, allowed to buy items at camp canteens, and given time for rest. Some camps organized sports, music, or language classes. These were not privileges the Japanese military had ever offered its own soldiers. Perhaps most unsettling of all was the behavior of American guards. Many guards were young men who treated the prisoners with professional distance rather than hatred. Some even showed curiosity, asking about Japan, families, or life before the war. 4 Japanese POWs conditioned to expect dehumanization. This neutrality felt almost unreal. In interviews conducted decades later, former prisoners often said the hardest part was not suffering, but confusion. They struggled to reconcile the enemy they had been taught to hate with the people they encountered every day. Kindness, however, did not erase the internal conflict. Shame remained powerful. Many Japanese POWs avoided writing home, fearing disgrace. Others worried that if they survived the war, they would never be accepted again in Japan. American camp authorities sometimes encouraged letter writing, not fully understanding the cultural weight attached to surrender. For the prisoners, survival itself felt like a burden. Yet over time, something slowly changed. As months passed, prisoners began to relax. Some learned English. Others began to understand American customs, music, and humor. They listened to radio broadcasts, followed baseball scores, and read newspapers. The image of Americans as savage enemies slowly faded, replaced by something far more complex and unsettling, a realization that everything they'd been told might have been wrong. This realization would not remain confined to the camps. When the war ended, thousands of Japanese POWs returned home carrying stories that contradicted official narratives. They spoke of fair treatment, full meals, medical care, and human dignity. These accounts clashed sharply with Japan's wartime propaganda and would later play a role in reshaping post-war attitudes. But at this moment, still deep inside the war, Japanese prisoners in American camps were living through a quiet psychological collapse. Not the collapse of morale through brutality, but the collapse of belief through kindness. The enemy they feared had not become their executioner. Instead, America had become something far more dangerous to wartime ideology, proof that the world was not as they had been taught. And for many Japanese POWs, that realization was more unsettling than any punishment they had ever imagined. By the time Japanese prisoners began arriving in larger numbers, the American system they encountered felt almost unreal to men who had been raised on battlefield codes that glorified death over surrender. Many of them expected immediate execution. Others believed they would be worked to death, beaten daily, or deliberately starved as revenge for the Pacific War. Instead, what confronted them was something far more confusing: order, routine, and restraint. For most Japanese POWs, the first shock came not from kindness, but from silence. Hurt did not shout. Rifles were present, but rarely raised. Commands were short, clear, and unemotional. There were no ritual humiliations, no theatrical punishments, no effort to strip away dignity beyond what captivity itself imposed. This calm professionalism unsettled men who had prepared themselves for cruelty. The second shock came with food. American rations were not luxurious, but they were regular, sufficient, and consistent. Rice was often substituted where possible, not as a favor, but because camp administrators understood that sudden dietary changes could cause illness. Vegetables, bread, meat, and coffee appeared with a predictability that many prisoners had not experienced even before capture. For men accustomed to shortages and shrinking rations late in the war, this alone felt deeply disorienting. Japanese POWs were also surprised to discover medical care was automatic. Wounded prisoners were treated alongside American soldiers. Illness was documented, not ignored. Dental care, vaccinations, and sanitation standards were enforced not out of sympathy, but policy. The Geneva Convention was not discussed, it was practiced. For many prisoners, this raised an unsettling question. If Americans were the enemy, why were they preserving their lives? The answer, of course, lay in a radically different military philosophy. The United States viewed prisoners as a resource to be secured, not a stain to be erased. POWs were evidence of victory, not dishonor. Killing them served no strategic purpose. Feeding them, housing them, and keeping them alive demonstrated control, confidence, and institutional strength. This mindset alone undermined much of the psychological conditioning Japanese soldiers had received before capture. As weeks turned into months, routines began to reshape expectations. Prisoners were assigned work details, often agricultural or maintenance-related, and paid small wages according to international law. The idea of being paid by the enemy for labor stunned many Japanese POWs. Money, even in token amounts, implied a recognition of personhood they had not expected to survive surrender. Cultural misunderstandings still occurred. Some prisoners initially refused food or work, believing cooperation dishonorable. American officers responded not with punishment, but patience. Interpreters explained rules repeatedly. Time, not force, became the instrument of compliance. Slowly, resistance faded. Not because beliefs changed overnight, but because reality contradicted fear day after day. Letters from home were allowed. Red Cross parcels arrived. News filtered in, sometimes months late, but still uncensored enough to reveal an uncomfortable truth. Japan was losing badly. For prisoners who had been told surrender meant disgrace without end, captivity began to feel less like a nightmare and more like a strange limbo suspended outside the war. Perhaps the most profound shock came from simple human interaction. American guards talked casually. Some shared stories. Others ignored prisoners entirely, which itself was revealing. There was no obsession with domination. No need to prove superiority through violence. The enemy, it seemed, did not need hatred to function. This lack of emotional intensity confused many Japanese POWs more than brutality ever could. Hatred could be understood. Indifference mixed with professionalism could not. It forced prisoners to confront the possibility that the enemy's strength came not from cruelty, but from organization, resources, and confidence. Over time, a quiet realization spread among many captives. The American war effort did not rely on fear alone. It relied on systems that functioned regardless of individual emotion. Guards rotated shifts. Supplies arrived on schedule. Camps expanded smoothly as prisoner numbers grew. Everything suggested a nation fighting with depth, redundancy, and long-term planning. This realization cut deeper than propaganda ever had. Japanese prisoners began to understand that they were not facing an opponent improvising survival, but one executing strategy. Even captivity reflected industrial and administrative power. If America could afford to treat enemies humanely, what else could it afford on the battlefield? By the end of this phase of captivity, fear had not vanished, but it had changed shape. It was no longer fear of torture or execution. It was the fear that everything they had been taught about the enemy was wrong, and that the war itself had been unwinnable from the start. For many Japanese POWs, this was the moment when psychological defeat truly began. Not at the moment of capture, not under fire, but quietly, in camps where survival was guaranteed, dignity was grudgingly preserved, and the enemy refused to behave like a monster. And that, more than any weapon, forced them to rethink everything they believed about America, about war, and about the cost of surrender. When the first groups of Japanese prisoners of war arrived in American custody, many of them believed they were already dead men walking. Years of imperial propaganda had drilled one message into their minds. Surrender was shameful, capture meant torture, and Americans were brutal enemies who showed no mercy. Some prisoners expected to be executed the moment they stepped off the transport ships. Others believed they would be beaten, starved, or publicly humiliated. None of them were prepared for what actually happened. As Japanese POWs were marched into American processing camps, the first shock was silence. There were no shouting guards, no screaming insults, no ritual punishment. Orders were given calmly. Medical officers stepped forward before interrogators. Wounded prisoners were treated immediately, often by American medics who worked with the same urgency they showed their own soldiers. Bandages were applied, morphine administered, and in some cases emergency surgery was performed within hours of capture. For men raised on the belief that the enemy was subhuman, this was deeply unsettling. Some Japanese prisoners initially assumed this kindness was a trick. They believed it was meant to weaken their resolve before torture began. Others refused food outright, convinced it was poisoned. American guards noted that several prisoners flinched whenever food trays were placed in front of them, waiting for the punishment that never came. The second shock came with the food itself. Instead of thin rice rations or near-starvation conditions common in late-war Japan, POWs were served hot meals prepared according to U.S. Army nutritional standards. Meat, vegetables, bread, and coffee were distributed on a regular schedule. For many prisoners, it was the most food they had seen in months. Some had lost significant weight during island fighting or naval service, and within weeks of captivity, they began visibly regaining strength. American officers were instructed to follow the Geneva Convention strictly, even though Japan itself had not signed or honored it in practice. POWs were housed in barracks, not cages. They were issued clean clothing, bedding, and basic hygiene supplies. Showers were provided. Lice control stations were set up to prevent disease. For Japanese prisoners accustomed to harsh discipline within their own military, the lack of constant punishment was confusing. The psychological impact was enormous. Many POWs later admitted that this treatment broke something inside them, not through cruelty, but through contradiction. Everything they had been told about Americans was wrong. Guards did not beat them for minor mistakes. Officers did not scream at them for showing weakness. In fact, American personnel often encouraged prisoners to rest, recover, and follow routines that resembled civilian life more than military captivity. Interrogations, when they came, were conducted without violence. American intelligence officers relied on patience, translators, and psychological insight rather than force. Some prisoners initially remained silent, expecting punishment for non-cooperation. None came. Over time, many began to speak voluntarily, not because they were coerced, but because the environment made resistance feel pointless. They were treated as human beings, not enemies to be crushed. One former Japanese naval rating later recalled that the most disturbing moment of his captivity was being offered a cigarette by an American guard. He had expected to be slapped or kicked for looking at the guard incorrectly. Instead, he was offered tobacco and a light. At that moment, he said years later, I realized the war I believed in did not exist anymore. Cultural misunderstandings were everywhere. American guards did not understand why some Japanese prisoners refused to give their names. Japanese prisoners did not understand why guards addressed them casually, sometimes even joking. In Japanese military culture, rigid hierarchy defined every interaction. In American camps, enlisted guards spoke freely, laughed openly, and treated prisoners with a professionalism that felt almost disrespectful in its informality. As days turned into weeks, many Japanese POWs began to confront an unbearable truth. Surrender had not led to dishonor in the way they had been taught. Instead, it had saved their lives. This realization caused intense internal conflict. Some prisoners experienced deep shame and depression, believing they had failed their families and emperor. Others quietly felt relief but were afraid to admit it, even to themselves. American camp psychologists noted unusually high levels of emotional withdrawal among Japanese prisoners in the early stages of captivity. Unlike German or Italian POWs, who often adapted quickly, Japanese prisoners struggled with identity collapse. Their entire worldview, built on sacrifice, obedience, and death before surrender, had been shattered by simple kindness. Yet that kindness never softened American security. Escape attempts were rare and quickly contained. Discipline existed, but was impersonal and procedural, not cruel. Violations resulted in loss of privileges, not beatings. This consistency reinforced a strange new reality. The enemy was firm, powerful, and fair. By the end of their first months in American camps, many Japanese POWs no longer feared execution or torture. Instead, they feared returning home. They worried how they would be judged after the war, how their survival would be interpreted, and whether the truth about American treatment would even be believed. Some wrote diaries. Others remained silent, watching American trucks deliver endless supplies, food, and equipment into camps that seemed to function without scarcity. What had begun as captivity slowly became an education, one that revealed not just American military strength, but American societal values. 4 Japanese prisoners raised to see war as spiritual destiny. This exposure was transformative. They were no longer just prisoners of war. They were witnesses to a system they had been told could not exist. And this realization, more than any battlefield defeat, marked the beginning of the end for the worldview that had carried Japan into the war. By the time Japanese prisoners began arriving in American camps in greater numbers, many of them were already physically exhausted, malnourished, and mentally shattered. Months or even years of brutal discipline within the Imperial Japanese Army had conditioned them to expect violence as the normal response to failure. Capture itself was considered worse than death. From the moment they stepped off transport ships or trains in the United States, many prisoners were certain they were walking toward torture, starvation, or execution. Instead, what greeted them was deeply confusing. Guards did not strike them. Rifles were carried low, not raised. Orders were given calmly, sometimes even politely. Medical officers examined wounds without shouting. Water was handed out freely. Food, real food, was distributed on schedules that made no sense to men who had survived on starvation rations. For many Japanese prisoners, the first night in an American camp felt unreal, as if they were trapped inside a carefully constructed deception. Years of propaganda had warned them that Americans were savage, undisciplined barbarians who would delight in cruelty. Yet guards enforced rules evenly and punished abuse. Red Cross standards were followed closely. Prisoners received blankets, proper shelter, and regular meals. The kindness was not theatrical or exaggerated. It was routine. That routine kindness was what unsettled them most. Japanese officers struggled to maintain authority within the camps. Their worldview had been built on absolute hierarchy, fear, and obedience. But American camp regulations treated officers and enlisted prisoners differently in ways that undercut that system. Officers were separated, not empowered. Brutal discipline was forbidden. Prisoners could not be beaten for mistakes. When American guards intervened to stop abuse between Japanese prisoners, it sent shockwaves through camp life. One former Japanese sergeant later admitted that the most frightening thing was not violence, but the absence of it. He said the Americans did not try to humiliate them. They did not force prisoners to renounce their beliefs. They did not demand confessions. Instead, they enforced order and then stepped back, as if expecting the prisoners to behave like human beings. Medical care became another point of disbelief. Prisoners suffering from malaria, dysentery, infected wounds, and malnutrition were treated by American doctors with the same methods used on U.S. soldiers. Some Japanese prisoners received surgeries that would have been unthinkable back home for anyone who had failed in battle. Medicine was not withheld as punishment. Recovery was expected. Food reshaped perceptions even faster than medicine. Meals were filling, consistent, and often unfamiliar. Bread, meat, vegetables, fruit, and coffee were served in quantities that felt impossible during wartime. Prisoners who had lived for months on rice mixed with substitutes struggled to finish American portions. Some believed the generous rations were temporary, part of a psychological trap before harsher treatment began. Weeks passed. The meals continued. American policy was deliberate. Officials believed humane treatment would encourage cooperation, reduce resistance, and demonstrate the contrast between democratic systems and militaristic brutality. They also understood that many Japanese prisoners were young men, shaped by fear rather than ideology. The camps became laboratories of quiet psychological collapse, not through cruelty, but through dignity. Slowly, prisoners began to talk. At first, only among themselves, then cautiously with guards. Some asked questions about America, about cities, factories, and families. Guards answered plainly. No threats followed. Trust did not arrive suddenly, but once it began, it spread. The most profound change came when prisoners realized they were not expected to die in captivity. Survival was assumed. Return home was discussed openly. For men who had believed capture erased their humanity, this realization struck deeper than any blow. It forced them to confront the lie at the heart of the system they had served. By the middle of their captivity, Many Japanese POWs no longer feared American guards. What they feared instead was returning home to a society that might punish them for surviving. Some admitted privately that captivity had shown them a different version of strength, one not built on terror, but restraint. This was not kindness born of weakness. It was discipline of another kind. And for prisoners raised to believe that mercy did not exist, it became the most powerful weapon they had ever encountered. By the final months of the war, the Japanese prisoners who had survived capture began to realize something that few of them had ever imagined possible. The enemy they had been taught to fear, the enemy described as brutal and dishonorable, was treating them in ways that contradicted everything they believed about surrender. For men raised on the idea that capture meant shame, torture, or death, daily life in American camps felt unreal, almost like a mistake that could vanish at any moment. Many Japanese POWs arrived expecting punishment. Instead, they found order. They found food served regularly, medical care offered without hesitation, and guards who followed rules rather than revenge. For some prisoners, the first shock was not kindness itself, but consistency. The Americans did not change behavior based on emotion. They followed procedures. That predictability alone shattered years of propaganda. As weeks turned into months, small moments carried enormous weight. A wounded prisoner receiving proper treatment. A guard explaining camp rules instead of shouting. A Red Cross package arriving with soap, letters, and cigarettes. These were not dramatic gestures, but they slowly dismantled the image of the enemy that Japanese soldiers had carried into captivity. What disturbed many prisoners most was the absence of cruelty. They waited for it. They expected it, but it rarely came. Instead, they saw guards go home after shifts, joke with one another, complain about food, and talk about families. These were not demons. They were ordinary men, and that realization was deeply unsettling. Some Japanese prisoners later admitted that the psychological impact of American kindness was stronger than physical hardship would have been. It forced them to confront uncomfortable questions. If the enemy was capable of humanity, then what had they been fighting against? And what had they been fighting for? For officers especially, this internal conflict was painful. Many had ordered men to fight to the death rather than surrender. Now they faced the reality that surrender did not mean dishonor in the way they had been taught. It meant survival. It meant reflection. And for some, it meant regret. American camp policies were not perfect, and life in captivity was still restrictive and humiliating in many ways. But compared to what Japanese soldiers expected, the camps represented a moral shock. They challenged the narrative of inevitable brutality that Japanese military doctrine had embedded into its soldiers. As the war ended and news of Japan's surrender reached the camps, emotions became even more complicated. Relief mixed with disbelief. Shame mixed with gratitude. Many prisoners felt torn between loyalty to their homeland and the undeniable fact that their captors had treated them with a level of humanity they never expected to receive. Repatriation was not a moment of celebration for all. Some Japanese POWs feared returning home more than they had feared captivity. They worried about judgment, rejection, and accusations of cowardice. Ironically, the place where they had been treated most humanely during the war was enemy territory. Years later, survivor testimonies revealed how profoundly captivity in America reshaped perspectives. Some former prisoners became outspoken critics of militarism. Others quietly carried the memory of American kindness as something deeply personal, almost sacred. They rarely spoke of it publicly, but it stayed with them. For historians, these accounts serve as a reminder that war is not only fought with weapons. It is fought with beliefs. And sometimes, those beliefs collapse not under violence, but under compassion. The story of Japanese POWs in American camps does not erase the brutality of the war or the suffering endured on all sides. But it complicates the narrative. It shows that even in total war, choices mattered. Systems mattered. Systems mattered. And how prisoners were treated left echoes long after the fighting stopped. In the end, many Japanese prisoners returned home carrying two truths. One was defeat. The other was the unsettling knowledge that the enemy they had been taught to hate had shown them mercy when they expected none. And that realization stayed with them for the rest of their lives. This was not the ending they had imagined when they marched into war, but it was the ending that forced them to rethink everything they thought they knew about honor, humanity, and the cost of believing lies.